Good morning, dear colleagues. I think we can start already. I'm glad to welcome you to this roundtable on one of the most topical, though rather recent, aspects of our legislation, which is legal regulation of development of legislation on endowments, and this is no accident that it's no accident that this subject has been included in the agenda of this conference, because in the Civic Chamber there's a special commission on promotion of volunteer activities, and this includes endowments too. So this commission, together with legal experts, has been working on various proposals and amendments of the legislation on endowments adopted in this country in December 2006. If we look at various areas of legislation, this endowment fund tool is one of the most promising, and there's ample foreign practice in this area, which has been developing for decades. So we are now having access to large volumes of data relating to the experiences of international funds and organizations. Although the law is recent, it was adopted in December 2006. As I have mentioned, endowment funds have been developing actively, and we can now see and look into what organizations and parties are involved in this activity. There is a definite trend in favor of endowment funds. Now I will introduce our speakers. Each will make their own presentation and touch on their specific aspects of discussion. We will have a chance to ask questions right after the presentations and at the end of the session.
Well, it was suggested by the organizers that we will make a break in the middle of the session. I don't think that we shall disagree with that. It's the third day of the forum, and it's the third morning, so we'll take advantage of that break, and that will help us to discuss, to have a fruitful discussion. So let me introduce our participants and introduce myself. I'm Larisa Deikova. I'm the member of the Public Chamber and the member of the Charity Foundation of Vladimir Potanin. So both the Chamber and the Foundation are actively involved in developing legislation in the area of endowments, because, as I said earlier, that's one of the most promising social and public technologies, enabling us to establish non-profit sector infrastructure to be sustainable. And let me introduce other members of the panel. Here is Werner Setelchuk, who is the executive president and director of Common Fund, taking care of various endowments management, and I think he's a very highly professional in this area, and we have a short history of endowments in Russia. However, in the United States, endowments have been in place for quite some time, so they have gained a lot of experience, and particularly in the Harvard University. And I think he will tell us the U.S. story, how they generate endowments, how they provide incentives for donors, and what technologies are there to be used, and what technologies are most efficient here. And I hope that his presentation will help us to get in more impressions and more ideas about endowments. Other speakers are Natalia Kreminarska, Kamenarska, Executive Secretary of the non-profit partnership, which is called the Donors Forum. And Natalia is not only an expert for the public chamber, rather she has been working in various non-profit projects for many years. She was actively engaged in drafting the legislation, and her contribution is really invaluable in the establishment and development of the infrastructure. And endowments and charitable endowments are very important elements of that structure. Our next speaker for the discussion is Ilya Chukalin. It's a rare case when an official and bureaucrat is capable of speaking with us in the same language, and he represents the Ministry for Economic Development. He is deputy head of the department and a member of various communities that are associated with the ministry. They represent various organizations which serve discussion platforms to discuss policies to support non-profit sector. And Ilya is the person who was very actively engaged in drafting the endowment legislation, and today he is helping us to use the technologies in the most efficient way. And let me introduce to you Olga Vaitovich, who will participate in the discussion, and she is a unique expert. She is the only legal counsel for the legal forum present here. That's a rare case, actually, when most of the discussion is done by non-lawyers. And she is the director of the legal department of the Interos company. So she is a professional who has been involved in drafting the legislation from the very start, and she continues contributing to that and provide consultancy for many Russian endowments, and I hope that her presentation will also be very useful to us. So I have concluded introductions, and now I'm turning the floor to Werner Sadlacek for the first presentation. And I would like to remind you of the fact that you can interrupt him and ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. I will hopefully be able to get through to you in English. My Russian is very poor, so please forgive me for speaking in my native language and not yours. It's great to be back here in St. Petersburg. I think the last time I was here was about 17 years ago, at a time when Harvard was investing, the Harvard Endowment was investing fairly significant dollars into Russian businesses. Which worked out fairly well over the period of about 15 years. So it's wonderful to be back in a different role, being able to talk about philanthropy and endowments in the United States. There is a handout, for those of you who can't read the screen, somewhere in your book. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time referring to this. I really want to cover 4 topics. The first really is the history or the importance of endowments and philanthropy in the United States, in that it is a very important segment of what happens in our country. And I'm going to then talk a little bit about the history of endowments and nonprofits in our country, going back a few hundred years, and show how it's really been a long progression of significant growth that's taken place. With that, I will talk about some of the legal structures and incentives that are actually created by the government to help nonprofits to grow and thrive. And then I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how endowments are managed in the United States. There's a very significant amount of investment dollars that are available as part of the endowments. It's really important how those are managed and overseen and the governance associated with it, which is probably the most important part of the effective management of that. So hopefully I can make this chart change. But what I wanted to do was start really with the size of the nonprofit universe in the United States. And this is a map of the U.S. that shows really the amount of endowments per county, down to a very local level in the U.S. And what you can see is that nonprofits exist really in every local aspect of the United States. You can see it's obviously concentrated in some of the more major metropolitan areas on the East Coast and the West Coast. But by and large, there's one nonprofit for every 175 citizens in the United States. So it's a very large and dynamic part of our economy, and one which has continued to grow very substantially, even relative to the rest of the U.S. economy. So a few statistics on this area are on the next page. There are about 2 million total nonprofits in the U.S. 1.6 million are really what we call public operations. The rest relate to religious organizations. 1 million of those are what we call public charities, which really represent educational institutions, both for kindergarten through 12th grade, secondary schools, as well as universities, healthcare organizations, which many operate as nonprofits. You have community foundations, which are set up in local communities really to assist, to take donations from the community and then give money back to the community. Those are really what we call the public charities that take place. There are about 100,000 private foundations which have been created, and these are really a result of an individual family having a significant amount of money and decide to create an organization that may last forever to assist with charitable activities in the United States. And then there are 500,000 organizations, 500,000 organizations, which are really fraternal organizations. The Elks and groups of people get together to work on charitable activities, as well as things like chambers of commerce that work to support local businesses in various communities. And so you can see it's a very large group, and it's been growing at about, in the last 10 years, it's grown by about 19%. So the number of nonprofits in the United States over the 10-year period has grown close to 20%. So the growth in this area continues to be very dynamic, with a significant amount of continued funding going on in this area. As you can see from the next bullet point, that basically about almost 10% of all of the wages in the United States are paid by nonprofits. So it is a very significant employer of people in the United States in terms of healthcare organizations, universities, and that, as I show on the slide later, has actually been growing faster than the rest of the economy. It contributes about 5.5% to total U.S. GDP, so it is a very significant contributor to the U.S. growth rate. And as we went through the Great Recession back in 2008 and 2009, nonprofits remained fairly stable, while businesses in other parts of the economy had significant challenges. You can see it has about $1.5 trillion of revenue, and it spends about $1.5 trillion. They're nonprofits, so they generally don't make money, but it's a huge contributor to to the economy. What you can see is that about 75% of the revenues come from services. So when a hospital takes care of a patient, it will charge for those services. When a educational institution provides education for a student, they charge for those services. So there's still a significant amount of the revenues come from actually providing services, hopefully at discounted levels, and then the remainder comes from gifts that people give to these institutions. And you see, in total, they have about $2.7 trillion of total assets, and that includes buildings. And about 1.2 trillion of the 2.7 trillion is actually investable assets. So assets that tend to go into the stock market or the bond market or other types of investments. So a significant amount of liquid assets that are invested into the U.S. economy as well as to other economies around the world. And then there's a very significant part of nonprofits that are represented by volunteerism, where people volunteer their time either on boards of trustees or through volunteer work at a hospital or educational institution or working with the poor to provide services. And about 26% of all people in the United States actually volunteer to work for nonprofits. When you look at the revenue and the expenses and the total assets associated with that, that's not reflected in the total revenue. That's volunteer services that are not that don't show up. If we go to the next page, which is page 4, what we can see is that the employment growth. This is looking at the 10 years from 2000 to 2010 in the United States. That over that period of time, the number of employees working for nonprofits has actually grown by 17%. While the government, the U.S. government and local and state governments has grown by about 8%, and because of the Great Recession fits into this, actually employees working for businesses has dropped by 6%. So as you can see, it's been a really, even during this very challenging time for the U.S. economy, in the 2008-2009 time period, it actually has been a tremendous area of growth, both in terms of assets and in terms of employment. The following chart looks at the growth of contributions. So the U.S. basically U.S. nonprofits basically get about $300 billion of contributions every year. And what you can see from this chart is certainly up until 2008, that growth has been very significant, and it peaked out at $310 billion and has since dropped slightly since then. But what you can see is that during this really number of year period of time, several decades, is that the amount that's actually gone into charity has increased substantially. And there really hasn't been a lot of changes in law or tax approach to create that increase in the growth, but certainly been an area where the amount of money that's being funneled into our nonprofit, our philanthropic sector in the United States has been pretty substantial. And as you can see, during the Great Recession, when you look at 2008 and 2009, the amount of disposable income people had obviously had decreased. And as a result, you can see that the amount of contributions went down quite substantially in 2008 and 2009, and now they're starting to come back. And the estimates are that it'll probably be back to the 2007 peak by 2015 or so. So it's slowly coming back after the Great Recession. The next chart looks at where the contributions come from. And what you can see is that almost 75%, 73% of the contributions actually come from individuals. And as we talk about the tax laws that support that and create that, what we can see is that there are tax advantages that are created by the tax incentives to really create that amount of individual giving. Many individuals in the United States, in terms of how they file for their taxes, don't individualize their deductions, and therefore they don't get the benefit of this. So about 70% of this individual contribution actually comes from people who take full advantage of the tax benefits that's given by the deductibility of the charitable contribution. And what you can see is that the other portions, foundations, are endowments that have been created over time, giving money to nonprofits, so it's kind of a re-gifting that goes on. Bequests is about 8%, and that's where people, there's incentives that are created because of the tax law to actually give money to a charity upon your death. So bequests are really, you put in your will, I want to give X amount of my estate to a charitable organization. Corporations are about 5%. And corporations' percentage has actually been shrinking over time in terms of contributions. The following page looks at where most of them go, and as you can see, most of the contributions, 32%, actually go to religious organizations, which is, about a third of the total contributions go to churches and religious organizations. The second largest is education, giving money to universities, giving money to schools, and then you can see a breakdown relative to the other areas that are taking place. Really only 4%, a very small percentage, goes to arts and culture, to philharmonics, to ballet, etc. So it's actually a fairly small amount that actually goes into that. Most goes into religion, most goes into education. So I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about the history of kind of foundations in the United States. And the Ford Foundation was actually created about 75 years ago. And the reason the Ford Foundation is so important to my organization is because about 40 years ago it actually created Common Fund, the organization that I work for. And so really what the Ford Foundation did in the 1960s is they did a lot of work looking at how the technology behind the way foundations and endowments for educational institutions operate. And this was the piece that came out called the law and lore of endowment management. And as a result of that, what they did was actually create my organization in 1971 called the Common Fund, which was really established to enhance the financial well-being of the nonprofit community through sound investment management, as well as work on the promulgation of best practices. So what I'm doing today, hopefully, is continuing to forward that mission that the Ford Foundation set up 42 years ago for Common Fund. So Common Funds, the Ford Foundation is very important to Common Fund. Common Fund is very important to the Ford Foundation. They actually gave a $2.3 million grant to create my organization. If you look at the current value of the Ford Foundation, they have about $10 billion in investable assets and give away about $400 million a year to various charities, including some activities I know in Russia. They also, over the life of their 75-year life, founded by Henry Ford and his son, actually have given away about $16 billion over the course of that 75 years. The first real foundation and the real concept of charity, when you go back, many of the universities had endowments that go back to, the 1600s, the 1700s. But the real concept of charity didn't really begin in the U.S. till the mid-1800s in terms of giving money to help with philanthropic activities. Many people gave money to the religious organizations through tithing, etc. But there really wasn't a culture of creating large pools of money to support philanthropy in the United States. And the first person to really do this was a guy named Peter Cooper, who was an industrialist. You can see he died in 1883, but made a lot of his money in steel and in railroads. This was what we called in the United States the robber baron period, when there was some very large pools of wealth that were created as a result of the very quick and massive economic expansion that was going on post the Civil War in the war between the states in the United States. So the first thing he really did, and the first time it really created this concept of having a philanthropic approach, was he founded a university called Cooper Union in New York City, which is focused on graduate architecture and engineering and arts, and funded it basically with $600,000, as well as created a large endowment. So to this very day, Cooper Union, unlike many universities in the United States, doesn't charge. So they have an endowment which basically supports the entire operation of the institution, and really started out doing it in a way which was very different than what had happened kind of historically relative to charitable giving. The next major robber baron, what we called robber baron industrialist, was Andrew Carnegie, who made all of his money in steel. And what he did was he really created when he sold his company, which was later called U.S. Steel, to J.P. Morgan for $450 million, what he decided was to give most of his money away. And he was really the first kind of true philanthropist in terms of saying, I've accumulated all this wealth. I don't want my kids to have all this wealth. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it all away. And that really set the stage for the kind of concept of foundations that have taken place in the United States. And so he really did a number of things. One of the things that he did was he built libraries throughout the United States, 2,500 libraries. He believed in education. And so I grew up in a very small town way out in western United States, and equivalent to Siberia in Russia, same temperatures. And in my small town, we had a library which was called the Carnegie Library, which was basically built by Andrew Carnegie. But he created the Carnegie Corporation, which was really in about 1910 or 1911, which was really the first true foundation with an endowment in the U.S. And over the years, in the last 50 years, it's given away about $2.5 billion in grants. The value today is about $2.5 billion. So a huge amount of charitable activities, as well as a number of foundations that have come out of it, the Carnegie Institute for International Peace, the Carnegie Hall, which is a big music hall in the U.S., Carnegie Mellon University. So he really created the first, kind of true concept of giving away, making lots of money and then giving it away, and funded many universities as well as many other things. The latest and most well-known of the philanthropists in the U.S. is Bill Gates, who many of you may know founded Microsoft, became a multi-billionaire. He's worth $67 billion. He's usually either the first or second richest person in the world. And again, his concept here, he looked at what the old robber barons did, what we call the robber barons, Carnegie and Rockefeller and Ford and Cooper, and said he really wanted to create an endowment that would fund a number of things, but focused on education, focused on health in Africa, had a number of very focused approaches. And the foundation currently is the largest in the world, has $34 billion of assets, and gives away about $3 billion a year. Unlike Carnegie, Ford, Rockefeller, Cooper, what he decided to do was kind of a new approach in the U.S. is he wanted to give his money away not in perpetuity. The Carnegie Corporation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation are set up basically to fund charitable activities forever. The expectation is that they will never cease to exist. Gates Foundation had a different approach. What Gates said was basically, I want to give my money away over my lifetime and my children's lifetime. And so he put an ending point on it, and he said that 40 years after his death, they will spend the last dollar out of this foundation. And so that is a very different approach than kind of the concept of this perpetual foundation that Rockefeller, Carnegie, and the like had set up during their period of time. He also created this giving pledge, which basically said, if you are really rich, I challenge you to make a pledge to give away half of your money. And there's been about 110 billionaires, including Mr. Potanin from your country, who have pledged to give away their fortunes and not hold it for the next generation, but pledged to give it away to charity. And so his emphasis on really telling people who have made vast amounts of wealth to give it away has had a real impact on the growth of philanthropy in the United States, and so and around the world, as we see people outside the United States take his pledge. And so it's a terrific thing that he's doing, and he's got a number of, as I said, more than 100 people around the world to pledge to give away their vast wealth. I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about the law around this. And as I said, the concept of giving to charity it goes way back, really to the 1800s, and it goes back a little bit before that, in that there was the concept that universities could set up endowments to help support their operations. And there are really kind of three focused levels that are involved in the oversight of charitable activities. The first is really, and the most prominent, is really the middle column in here, which is the state government. The state governments, New York, California, Kansas, Illinois, the state governments are ultimately responsible for oversight of charitable activities. The view of the government is that basically those are local responsibility. They're not really federal, and that the attorney generals of each state are ultimately responsible for oversight of charity. And this really goes back generations. It's not something new. So the federal government, the U.S. government, by and large, has very little oversight responsibility for U.S. nonprofits. And so from that standpoint, I think it's different than many other organizations, many other countries. So ultimately, the only entity that can really bring legal action against a nonprofit is the Attorney General of the state. And they've done that where they have seen, when they've seen there have been problems. In New Jersey, they've done it. In Washington, D.C., they've done it. They also done it in Massachusetts. And their job is to make sure to protect the public who gives the money to this charity, to protect them, to make sure the money is being spent properly. There was really, since the Great Recession, there's been a new law passed in many of these states called the Uniform Management of Prudent Management Institutional Funds Act, and you see that up there. It's called UPMIFA, and that really outlines the responsibility that the board of trustees, each of these organizations, nonprofits, has a board of trustees, and they are responsible to act in prudent fashion with respect to that law. Not spend too much money in any given year, not to pay people too much, and to ensure that there's the long-term proper management of that fund. On the federal level, the only thing that really the government oversight is related to the Internal Revenue Service, which is our taxing authority. And so from that perspective, the IRS, while these entities don't really pay taxes most, the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, the taxing authority, has taken upon themselves to really provide some level of oversight of the nonprofits in terms of how the governance takes place. And that's, I think, and that's expanding. So if we look at it, ultimately the state governments are responsible for it, but the federal government has begun to take on more responsibility through the taxing authority. Because these entities are tax exempt and the donations that come to them are provided really with a subsidy from the U.S. government, that provides for them, the IRS, to be able to oversee what they've got. And just in the last, I think, about 3 or 4 days, there's been a kind of a scandal that's broken out in the United States, where the nonprofit tax authority began to look very hard at nonprofits that were set up by organizations which may oppose the President of the United States, President Obama. And so there's a scandal now that's taking place where the head of this agency, the tax authority, has just resigned as a result of the scandal. So in the United States, obviously, we have to be very sensitive about making sure that there's oversight of nonprofits, but to make sure it's done in a way which is fair to all. If you look at the benefits that are really created in the United States, ultimately, the biggest contribution that's made by the federal government is to allow people who donate money to nonprofits to take it as a tax deduction. So in effect, if you reduce your income subject to tax by your contribution. So if you're paying a tax rate at a 30%, in effect what happens is you have to pay taxes, 30% less taxes on those amounts that you give to nonprofits subject to limitations. And so that really goes back to really the beginning of the tax code, income tax in the United States, which basically dates back to the early 1900s, where they provide this benefit of allowing you to deduct that contribution. In addition, one of the other benefits that provides is if you have stock that has appreciated in value. So for instance, if you bought a stock at $100 a share and it's gone to $200 a share, you're able to donate that stock, get a tax deduction for the $200 and never have to pay capital gains tax on the difference between the $100 and the $200. So in effect, there's a benefit that you can give property that has appreciated and get the full tax deduction without having to pay taxes on that gains. Private foundations, basically you can set up a private foundation and deduct the value of that creation of a private foundation against your income taxes. So that's a terrific benefit. And so when you think about that $300 billion that were given to nonprofits that I described on the second slide, that actually reduces the amount of revenue to the U.S. government by the tax impact of that $300 billion. So if you think about it as if they pay 30% tax on average, the U.S. government helped to fund $90 billion of those contributions. One other small benefit is that, in addition, most nonprofits are allowed to borrow tax exempt, which means the people who buy the bonds don't have to pay taxes on the income. So that's another benefit that's really created through the current tax structure. Now, as the U.S. government continues to be challenged for money, one of the things they continue to look at is whether to do away with this tax deductibility of charitable contributions. And, you know, obviously, there are many people who are arguing against that for obvious reasons. So, lots of support from the U.S. government in terms of tax deductibility, in terms of the ability to pay less interest, et cetera. Let me just comment on a couple of other things. I've been doing a lot of these kind of presentations around the country, around the world, really, because in a number of countries, China, Australia, UK, and Japan, they're really trying to create a more effective a more effective nonprofit structure to encourage philanthropy. Many of the common law, Australian and the UK, have just begun to allow tax deductibility of charitable contributions. So it's a very new thing for them. They tend to be more government-funded education and healthcare. And so citizenry doesn't necessarily have the same focus on philanthropy and giving money away that they do in the U.S. China, which is a civil society not necessarily based on common law, is looking at how to create a nonprofit sector within their economy. Universities are looking to increase their endowments. They actually have passed legislation that allows corporations to take a certain percentage of their revenue or their income and donate it to create a separate foundation. So now in China, there are thousands of foundations that have been created. The earnings in the foundation, you have to pay taxes on it, unlike in the U.S., and you have to pay out 8%, a significant payout rate. Japan, again, they're another country that's looking to how to create kind of this charitable sector that exists in the United States, in their country. So there's a significant groundswell outside of the United States. I think people looking at the policies that the U.S. has had in place over the years as a way to really help to enhance the activities to help their poor and to help their education and healthcare institutions. And I think from that standpoint, what's going on today here in St. Petersburg makes a lot of sense with respect to thinking of how to put in laws to create a nonprofit sector that in fact works very well. I know I'm need to wrap it up my time, right? Yes. I just wanted to go to one more slide, if you turn to page 25. One of the things that I had obviously more than a half hour's worth of presentation here. One of the things that's most important, when you think about this $1 trillion that's invested to really support. So what you do is you invest your $1 trillion and you spend roughly 4 to 5% of that money every year to support the charity. So you have this pool of capital which really exists in perpetuity. And so you have to really be able to grow your pool of capital at the rate of inflation, right, while spending a certain percentage, around 5%. So the 5% goes to support the current charities that you're supporting. The pool that you continually hold on to supports future charity. And so the balancing between the two becomes very difficult. And what you can see from this slide on this page is really the asset allocation. These investments are invested in assets which are expected to grow, when you combine them all together, at something greater than the rate of inflation, more than 5%. So you have to take some degree of risk associated with this investment. And that degree of risk really is, when you look at it, you can see that we have 4 different types of charities here: educational institutions, foundations, operating charities, and healthcare. And what you can see from this chart is that basically a lot of the assets are invested in things called alternatives. And those are hedge funds, private capital, real estate, distressed debt, natural resources. And you can see in the orange how much that investment has grown. So the challenge of trying to return inflation plus 5% is pretty significant. And you really have to take risk in terms of your investment approach to get there. And that's one of the reasons when I was at Harvard, we invested money in Russian equities. We recognized that they were risky, but we also expected to see very, very significant growth out of that. So with that, I will wrap up and thank you for your patience and for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I guess we'll have questions potentially later on.
Пожалуйста, уважаемые коллеги, вопросы?
Dear colleagues, are there questions? Please introduce yourself. I'm Vladislav Blatov.
You described us about practical life of United States donors, but you said very few information about tax and another law of the United States. Could you explain us more? Maybe mecenas and donors of the United States have not only tax exemptions, but maybe customs law, maybe a special offshore or special economic zone. Could you explain us more about this topic?
So my understanding of the question is you want to kind of go beyond the tax law associated with that supports nonprofits. Is that
I mean the law that make popular and interest to donate. I mean the money question that я имел в виду.
What I meant is what are the form of how our benefits are initiated, not only in terms of taxation, but also in the form of some special economic zones. For example, where are there other benefits that sponsors may enjoy other than taxation, tax deductions?
No. But no, there really are several levels. I mean, the first, the donors provide, get a tax deduction for the amount of contribution they make to the charity. So that's the first. So when I give $100 to a charity, I can deduct it against my income, and basically the government pays 30%. Second is that most nonprofits, not all, but most nonprofits pay no income tax on any of their earnings. So that if you have a large amount of capital gains, if you have a large amount of revenue, there's no tax on that. There's a small exception for private foundations. So all of the growth in earnings in the U.S. in these foundations are tax-free. And the third is that you can borrow money from the market, and the holder of that debt doesn't have to pay taxes, so you borrow more cheaply than if you than a normal corporations. But there's no real special economic structure that goes beyond the non-taxability of the earnings from that nonprofit.
Риэлторы любят, извините, да.
Real estate experts like to repeat that location is king in their business. Lawyers say that legislation is king, but in this area, in the discussion, in the subject we are discussing, there's nothing like taxation. Taxation is king. So let's ask more questions to our American colleague. You told us about capitals coming to charitable foundations. It's divided into obvious parts. 30% goes to the church, 30 to education, and 30 to culture. But is the state, the government, the federal government, capable of redistributing this structure to close some gaps in which they are interested themselves? And if not, then what's the point of cooperating with the government? If the government, the federal government, does not receive taxes from those nonprofits, then they should probably try to compensate that with something else.
The federal government really doesn't oversee where the charitable contributions go. The one thing they can do is they could focus on different types of deductions for different types of organizations. But by and large, the contributions, once you establish your charity, once the federal government says you have a charitable organization, whether it's to support culture, support education, or to support religion, the donors who give to that are free to give to whoever they want. And so it's very little government interference or government direction in terms of where the donations go. I can give all my money to church, or I can give all my money to education. That is my choice. And once the charity is set up, the federal government really has very little control over it. And certainly at some point they could come in and say, well, we're going to tax earnings on foundations, or we're going to tax earnings on endowments, educational endowments, or we don't think healthcare organizations are making doing charitable activities. But as of yet, they haven't done anything like that. And while there has, periodically is discussion about that, to this point, there hasn't been any real interference from the federal government in where I'm allowed to give my money and how the tax takes place on that.
Одно короткое замечание по поводу того, в чем же...
One short remark on what the advantage is for the federal government. In the United States, there's no Department of Culture, and there's no federal budget for any cultural institutions, and that's a response to your question, where the interest of the state lies. It's not spending state budget resources on that. Thank you very much for your presentation. And apart from tax deductions, has the United States had any experience like encouraging the creation of endowment foundations, nurture foundations, or something like that?
There has not been kind of any overt activity in the last 30 years to really encourage more giving to foundations or endowments. The tax rules have remained relatively static. since I've been doing this for about 30 years, and they've been static over that 30-year period, and so there really hasn't been kind of changes that have taken place at the federal level to create the new concept of endowments. What we've seen is really, in the 80s and 90s and 2000, there's been a tremendous amount of wealth created in the United States, and people like Bill Gates and others have really begun to kind of take giving through private foundations to a new level that really hasn't existed before. The government obviously is always concerned about too much money that they don't have control over, although the federal government, while they allow the tax deduction, really isn't the one that's responsible for overseeing charities in the U.S.
Спасибо большое, коллеги. Давайте мы перейдем к следующему выступлению, к следующей презентации. У нас еще будет...
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. In the end, you'll have another chance of asking questions and making remarks. Now, Natalia Kaminarskaya. The microphone is yours. Good morning, dear colleagues. It's quite a pleasure for me to speak at this legal forum, because for us non-profit representatives, it's a subject which is very dear and close to us, and we are trying to promote it, and it's always a pleasure when we can discuss this at fora which are not directly associated with non-profit organizations. And it's very good that we're having practitioners here and people that have directly to do with endowment foundation efforts. But I'll start by giving you an overview of the endowment market before we discuss changes in legislation. So I'll start from the definition of an endowment as it is made in Russia. It may not be as nice as it might sound in English or in the U.S. Law, but an endowment in Russia is part of the property of a non-profit organization, which is handed over to a managing company for earning a profit to be used in the statutory activities of the non-profit organization. This may be a cumbersome definition, but I'm sure that my colleagues who are present in this room really have an idea of what it is. So there has to be a managing entity, which is something that other countries don't have, and the taxes that should be levied are given over to the non-profit organization. And amendments have been discussed since the law was adopted, but quite a number of organizations have been set up already with endowment foundations or which are planning to create them. And we already have some 91 organizations that have an endowment foundation or are raising funds for it, while covering a significant part of the road to it. It's not in every sphere of our life that we can create endowment foundations. Most of them are in education, and this is not accidental, because universities were the most active participants in discussing this tool. for a stable nonprofit sector in Russia. They have a good donor base. They're alumni, and now 62 out of the 91 organizations are supporting education, followed by health, public health, and then only by culture, sports, and other sectors. We hope that culture will grow, and this year we've been making efforts to promote this at the workshops dedicated to culture. And financially, can we already speak of a market of endowments? Yes, we can. Of course, I would love to cite greater numbers, but for the Russian nonprofit sector, I think the accumulated amount of 22.8 billion rubles is already a significant amount. And as you can see, despite the fact that the early period fell on the crisis years of 2007 and 2008, still funds have been raised, and last year we witnessed the emergence of a few very interesting endowments, and this hopefully will continue. Most of them operate in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but many universities that create endowments are already are also operating in other regions, and we hope that this trend will continue. So not only in Moscow, but elsewhere, there will be more endowment organizations. What we can be proud of and what we have achieved over these 6 years is this. Although endowments is a new thing which is not yet part of the information space, I can say that various segments of the population are interested in it, and if you Google endowment, then the number of hits has grown very dramatically over the past year. Among other achievements and things that facilitate the development of endowments in Russia, I would like to name the Endowment Club, an association of major charitable foundations and companies. And this club is an association of those who have set up their endowment foundations or are interested in that. And in your handouts, you will find info on the club, as well as our recommendations for those who would like to develop endowments. This is where you could ask your questions, and on June 10th we'll hold a meeting in St. Petersburg on the premises of the European University, which is one of the oldest members of our club. And now there are two factors that have an impact on the development of this sector in Russia. Is that in contrast to tax benefits, the Ministry for Economic Development has offered a subsidy to those who are interested in this activity. So we've been using it, and we've been trying to promote it wherever possible.
And the other, not less significant program being implemented in the country is the private endowment or charitable endowment established by Mr. Potanin, and they help to all those who are involved in fundraising, since it's our major issue. In theory, everybody understands what endowment means, and It's in the interests of everybody. However, how to get those contributions is a problem in this country. It's different from the United States and Western Europe. So, together with the Russian Economic School, we try to train people how to raise funds to endowments. And it's the club, using the subsidies, arranged a trip to the United States for some people. It was not Harvard University, but we visited a number of universities in Washington, D.C. and New York City, and it was a very valuable experience for all of the people. Also, we publish a lot of textbooks and publications to help people understand how to raise funds. And to provoke your questions, I may ask. You may ask. You've been in existence for 6 or 7 years, and only a few organizations of the kind were established. Well, we are still faced with a number of issues and challenges. We are trying to address them, and probably with your help and based on today's discussions, we will find some better ways to take care of endowments. And even the Russian translation of endowment may raise some questions. So it takes time to explain people what it really means, and talk those people who are probable donors into making contributions. And as I said earlier, there are 91 organizations in Russia of the kind, but mostly they are associated or affiliated with museums, hospitals, and universities. They are not experienced in making all the financial statements and reporting. So it's not easy to find proper standards and proper ways to do so. Also, we would like to see some amendments in the legislations. I don't think that I should speak of that right now. We can devote more time in the second part of the session. And as I said earlier, our ultimate objective is fundraising. And it's not only about endowments, it's just about donations and contributions in general in this country. And despite all those challenges, I'm still an optimist about the future, and I think that there is a potential in establishing joint endowments to support social programs. And we make presentations on the matter using various platforms and opportunities, and I think we will succeed. And speaking of some technical problems, I think that later on we will see some amendments in the legislation, and that will help us too. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Your questions? If there are no questions at this point, I suggest we make a break for 15 minutes. And after the break, we will have more presentations by Ilya, Olga, and me, and we will try to understand how we can make our professional contribution better and more efficient. Thank you.